Mandarin with its thousands of characters, or Arabic because of its complex writing system and difficult pronunciation, or maybe Hungarian with its 18 different cases. Which language deserves the title of most difficult to learn? What even makes a language difficult? A language that's incredibly challenging for one person might be relatively straightforward for another. Japanese is often called one of the hardest languages to learn for English speakers, but for Korean speakers, not so much. And while Mandarin with its different tones and characters might drive an English speaker crazy, its grammar is actually much simpler than English. In this video we look at some fascinating features of different languages and we will figure out which one is the hardest to learn. That is, if such a thing exists. Let's start by understanding why this question is more complex than it might seem. First of all, we need to be clear what we are talking about. We are not discussing constructed languages like Izquil or languages spoken by only a handful of people. We're looking at popular languages you might actually want to learn. The difficulty of a language comes down to several factors. In this video, we will consider the following. Writing systems. How many characters do you need to learn? How complex are they? Sound systems, from tones to throat sounds to pitch accent. Everything that has to do with pronunciation. Grammar features, cases, conjugations, and other structural complexities. And finally, practical factors, available resources and exposure opportunities. We start at the top with writing systems. Mandarin Chinese is often considered difficult because of its thousands of characters. But here's the thing, unless you're planning to become a calligrapher, you don't need to learn how to write these by hand. Reading is what matters, and with digital tools that's become much more manageable. That being said, it's still a boatload of work to memorize how these characters look and what they mean. Japanese even takes this one step further, at least in theory. It has not one, not two, but three writing systems. Luckily, two of them are very easy to learn, and only kanji, which are basically imported Chinese characters, are a challenge. What makes this even trickier though is that even if you think you know what a kanji means, you don't necessarily really know what it means in which context or how to read it and pronounce it in the first place. Because they can have different readings depending on context. That's why I'm only learning vocabulary and not kanji in isolation. Arabic presents a different kind of challenge with its writing system. There are only 28 letters, which sounds easy enough. But unfortunately, the letters change form depending on their position in the word, making it difficult to recognize them at first. And to make things even more interesting, they usually drop the short vowel sounds in written text. This means you often need to figure out how to read a word from context. For example, the three consonants KTB could be read this way, or this, or like 100 other options. So again, you need to know the word from context to know how to pronounce it. And as a nice little bonus, you're writing from right to left. So to summarize this section, I guess we are really lucky with our writing system in English. Or are we? English writing is actually really hard. We are just so used to it. The relationship between spelling and pronunciation is, well, weird to say the least. Why do though, through, and cuff all end in OUGH but sound completely different? Why is the S in island silent? Where did the K in knife, night, and no go? Why is it height but also weight? Why is this read and at the same time read? English spelling is a wild ride because these inconsistencies are absolutely everywhere. So English is a very difficult language to write for non-native speakers. But writing systems are just one small piece of the puzzle of what's the most difficult language to learn. Let's look at one factor that might be even more difficult for some, which is tones, or rather sound systems. When it comes to sound systems, tonal languages like Mandarin Chinese or Vietnamese often get mentioned first. In these languages, the syllable can have completely different meanings depending on the tone you use. Mandarin has 4 of these tones and Vietnamese has 6 even.
Ba, 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 ba.
Many people think these different tones are unique to Asian languages. But once again, English has its own little quirks and difficulties here. Think about how the word really can mean completely different things depending on how you pronounce it. Really expresses genuine curiosity or surprise. Really is a confirmation or agreement. Really shows skepticism or sarcasm. Then there are sounds that some languages have that others completely lack. Arabic is famous for its throat sounds, which can be particularly challenging for English speakers.
عين Ayn is pronounced from the middle of the throat. Ghayn. Ghayn is pronounced from the highest part of the throat.
Though as a German speaker, I at least have a little bit of an advantage here, as these throat sounds are at least somewhat similar to the ones we already have in German. Japanese pronunciation is fairly consistent and not that hard, but its pitch accent system and blazingly fast speech rate can make it really hard to follow and copy. German pronunciation is also somewhat difficult, but that's not really because of individual sounds, but more because some German words are long and we love to stack consonants, like in Angstschweiß, Schlittschuhläufe, Eichhörnchen or Rechtsschutzversicherungsgesellschaften. So we looked at writing, we looked at pronunciation. Let's look at another factor that might really drive you crazy, and that is grammar, or rather its inconsistencies. Hungarian, for example, has 18 different cases. For comparison, English has basically 0, German has 4, and Russian has 6. And just when you think you've got them all memorized, you discover that Hungarian also loves to stack suffixes on suffixes through agglutination. That's a lot of crazy lingo, so let me explain what that means. Take this word, which means house. You can add suffixes for possession, location, numbers and more, all to the same word. So this one means in my houses. And you can keep going. This one would mean in each of my houses. That looks fun, but at least Hungarian is consistent with its rules. Arabic, on the other hand, takes grammar complexity to the next level. Not only does it have complex verb conjugations that change based on person, number, gender, tense and mood, but the root system means that most words are built from 3 consonant roots that can transform into dozens of related words. Plus it has both gender systems and cases. It's like they looked at every possible grammatical feature and said, yes, we'll take them all. Japanese grammar too is very difficult for English speakers to learn, not because it is complex per se, but because it's just so different from what we are used to. Mandarin grammar, on the other hand, is actually quite simple. No conjugations, no gender, no plural forms. Instead of changing the verb to different tenses like we do in English, for example, or even more so in languages like French, Spanish, Portuguese, Mandarin just adds time indicating words like yesterday or tomorrow, and the verb stays exactly the same. Want to make something plural? Just add a number or many before it. And with just a handful of particles, Mandarin handles what other languages need complex grammar for. Japanese, by the way, has these particles too. Instead of a handful, there are 188. They all give words different meanings and functions. And because that's clearly not difficult enough, there's this whole dropping words thing, where essential parts of the sentence are just gone. It's like every conversation is a guessing game where you need to fill out the blanks of what the other person really wants to say. And this brings up an interesting point. Things you are not used to are naturally more difficult. English speakers often find Spanish or French easier to learn, not because they're objectively simpler languages, but because they share so many features with English. English is a Germanic language, but at the same time it's kind of not, because most of its words come from Latin and French, which are both Romance languages. So learning other Romance languages isn't that difficult. Meanwhile, English has plenty of complexities that drive non-natives absolutely crazy. Like its different tenses or those phrasal verbs where adding a preposition completely changes the meaning. Or when you can put any word in front of shit to create new meanings. Dog shit is terrible, bullshit are lies, horse shit is complete nonsense, and bad shit is crazy, of course. To a non-English speaker, this probably seems as arbitrary as the particles in Japanese do to English speakers. But beyond all these linguistic features, there are some very practical factors that determine how difficult a language is to learn. The most obvious one is resource availability. English is arguably the easiest language to learn. And that is not because English is easy, it's just because English is everywhere. Movies, music, websites, apps, even street signs. You're constantly exposed to English whether you want to or not. One of the reasons I built Langia is to solve this content availability problem. Maybe you have your favorite blogs in English but can't find similar content in your target language. Or the content exists but it's way above your level. Langia lets you take any web article, simplify and translate it to your level and thereby make it accessible to you. Plus you get daily stories matched to your interests and level in your target language. Because having engaging material that you can understand is the most important factor no matter what language you're learning. I actually had a guy in my comments who wanted to learn Korean and he couldn't speak English, but since all the good learning material that he wanted to use for Korean was not available in his native language, he learned English first. So he ended up learning English just to access better Korean learning materials. This exposure and availability factor is huge. You might be studying the quote-unquote easiest language in the world, but if you can't find adequate material or a practice partner, you're going to struggle. On the flip side, you might be tackling a, again, quote-unquote difficult language, but if you're passionate about its movies, music, or culture, you'll probably make much faster progress. This is why some institutes that categorize languages by difficulty list Arabic, Mandarin, Cantonese, Japanese, and Korean as the hardest languages to learn. But they are really just measuring the distance from English and the typical amount of study hours needed. They don't consider your actual native language, your interests, or your access to resources. If someone points a gun at my head and I have to tell him one language that is the most difficult to learn for an English speaker, I would choose Arabic. Its writing is hard, its pronunciation is hard, its grammar is hard, and its availability isn't that great either, because dialects are so wildly different to the point where they use completely different vocabulary and even grammar. If I don't have a gun pointed at my head and I can give a more balanced response where I don't need to decide on one specific language, I would first of all say that each language has its difficulties and that there is no most difficult language to learn per se. The most difficult language to learn is the one you're not interested in. Because in the end, what matters isn't how many cases a language has, or how complex its writing system is. It's how motivated you are to learn it, how much you enjoy engaging with it, and what resources you have available. You might struggle with easy Spanish if you hate every minute of it, while making steady progress in difficult Japanese, because you genuinely enjoy the culture and resources. Speaking of how languages are different, if you're interested in how learning a new language might change the way you think and see the world, check out my video about linguistic relativity. We dive into some fascinating examples of how different languages describe and categorize the world in completely different ways. Thank you for watching, and I see you next time.